Women's Human Rights Campaign is a feminist group dedicated to promoting women's sex-based rights. This conference will centre on the campaign's Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights, which is a comprehensive defence of biological sex as a legal category, as opposed to so-called gender identity. The declaration has been signed by over 12,000 people and 263 organisations from 122 countries. This webinar today will introduce the declaration's 9 articles, as well as a litany of recent examples of harm caused to women and children by gender identity legislation. So our speakers today are Laura Lecuona, Women's Human Rights Country Contact for Mexico, philosopher, translator and editor. She disseminates feminism in every way she can. We also have Maureen O'Hara, from the UK, feminist activist, lawyer and legal academic. She's co-author of the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights. The focus of her activism and research is men's violence against women and girls, particularly in the sex trade, and the harms caused to women and children by gender identity ideology. Thirdly, we will have Eugenia Rodrigues, radical feminist, Women's Human Rights Campaign, country contact for Brazil, and spokesperson of No Corpo Certo, On the Right Body, a Brazilian campaign against transing kids. And to finish off, we're going to have Kara Dansky, a US-based feminist feminist, chair of the Women's Human Rights Campaign Committee on Law and Legislation, an active participant in the Women's Human Rights Campaign US.
The Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights, one of whose authors is here with us today, is a careful and well-argued document explaining several reasons why the category of sex shouldn't be replaced with that of gender identity in the law. I will try to explain now why gender identity shouldn't be enshrined in law, not from the legal point of view, but from a more conceptual one. First of all, sex, which is a concrete and easily verifiable characteristic, and is the basis of women's oppression, and the very reason why women as women need special protections in the law, shouldn't be dispensed with. Sex is a category which should be maintained in the law for the sake of women and girls, and erasing it means failing to protect them. Protect them concretely from discrimination and male violence. Furthermore, gender identity has no place in the law for the simple reason that gender identity doesn't exist. But you don't have to take my word for it. Let's see what the Yogyakarta principles, which are the original source of every other gender identity definition you will find in bills and acts throughout the world, have to say about it. The Yogyakarta principles state, gender identity is understood to refer to each person's deeply felt internal and individual experience of gender, which may or may not correspond with the sex assigned at birth, including the personal sense of the body and other expressions of gender, including dress, speech, and mannerisms. The first thing that strikes the eye is a secular definition, of course. If you use the term being defined as part of the definition, you are not informing enough. Gender identity is the individual experience of gender isn't explanatory at all. Secondly, notice how this definition assumes sex is something assigned at birth. This goes against all scientific and empirical knowledge on the subject. Sex is determined since conception. Nobody assigns it, not even the doctor or midwife. The baby already has a sex at birth, and it can be very easily deduced from the observation of his or her genitalia, which are its most evident manifestation. Thirdly, we can infer gender identity has some vague relationship with sex because it may correspond or not with it, or so they say. Now, how do we know if it corresponds or not? The Yogyakarta principles don't give us the answer, but there might be a clue on the dress, speech, and mannerisms. Maybe if the person likes to dress in men's clothes and was assigned male at birth, there is correspondence. But if the person likes to dress in women's clothes, even though they were assigned male at birth, the person, that correspondence is lacking. So even if we still don't know what exactly is gender identity, there is the suggestion that it can be expressed by the clothes one likes to wear. But are fashion preferences something we deeply feel internally? Are they essential to our identity or sense of self, according to this definition? 10 years after issuing those principles, they were complemented with some additional ones. These offer the definition of gender expression, which might throw some light on the issue or not. Let's see. Gender expression, say these Yogyakarta plus 10 principles, is to be understood as each person's presentation of the person's gender through physical appearance, including dress, hairstyles, accessories, cosmetics, and mannerisms, speech, behavioral patterns, names, and personal references. And gender expression may or may not conform to a person's gender identity. Moreover, gender expression is included in the definition of gender identity. There you are, another pretty circular definition. Gender expression is the presentation of the person's gender through appearance, and it is included in the definition of gender identity, but gender expression may or may not conform to a person's gender identity. Don't blame yourselves if you are confused by this. It is confusing. Gender identity advocates tell us there is only one way to know what gender identity one has, and only one person in the world has direct access to that knowledge, oneself. Nobody else can know unless one chooses to inform them. But what if somebody lies? We can't know through our senses what somebody else's gender identity is, and it cannot be contrasted with anything else. So in order to be informed about it, we have to ask them. But we also have to suppose that they won't lie to us under any circumstances. The most surprising thing is, legislations in many parts of the world have already substituted this crazy little thing called gender identity for sex. How is it possible? Was everybody asleep when those changes were approved? Nobody was curious enough as to ask for a clear and understandable definition of, or rebel enough to vote against it? I have a hypothesis. Maybe legislators and decision makers who have voted in favor of laws including this foggy concept are falling into what Cass Sunstein calls social cascades, and this is how he defines them. Large-scale social movements in which many people end up thinking something or doing something because of the beliefs or actions of a few early movers. Participation in cascades is fueled by social influences. The system of legal precedent also produces cascades as early decisions lead later courts to a certain result, and eventually most or all courts come into line, not because of independent judgments, but because of a decision to follow the apparently informed decisions of others. The sheer level of agreement will be misleading if most courts have been influenced, even decisively influenced, by their predecessors, especially in highly technical areas. So, for example, deputies from City C have to vote a bill about something called gender identity. They don't fully understand what might that be, but they do know that there is a document that defines it and explains it. And CTA and CTB have already approved the Gender Identity Act. So even if they themselves are confused about it, others more knowledgeable surely must understand it. Otherwise, there would be no Gender Identity Acts anywhere in the world. One of the reasons why people prefer to follow the opinion of others is because they grant them more authority in the matter than themselves. Another possible reason is because if they internally disagree, they might prefer not to say it out loud. They don't want to be dissenters. In this case, regarding gender identity, and in the intellectual climate we are living in, they might know that a simple question or the mere expression of a doubt might give rise to the accusation of transphobia. So why bother? There's something else that worries me regarding the adoption of this obscure concept of gender identity, and it pertains to what is known as law's expressive function. That is, a law may convey a social meaning that reinforces or changes the norms of the community beyond its role in establishing and enforcing rules. In other words, laws send a message to the people governed by them. The mere concept of gender identity, as several feminists have pointed out, means that sexual stereotypes are not something arbitrary and socially constructed, as feminism has it. The idea that we all have a gender identity which is expressed through dress, hairstyle, and mannerisms means that something as superficial as our tastes in clothes are somehow ingrained in our own very self, and most probably innate. If you thought that in 2020 we had overcome the idea that a girl must like girly things and a boy must like boyish things, it is coming back with a vengeance. They are compelling us to believe in a gender soul, some immaterial entity they don't even bother to define satisfactorily. It's as if we were required to believe in the existence of phlogiston, that fire-like element with which centuries ago alchemists attempted to explain combustion. Gender identity is the phlogiston with which gender identity theorists want to explain why some boys and some girls don't conform to sexual stereotypes. Feminism, with its theory of the social construction, provides a much better explanation. There are some other problematic consequences of introducing gender identity into law. As you may know, in several countries, healthy girls and boys who rebel against stereotypes, as one should, are being labeled as transgender. And here, the concept of gender identity serves as the vehicle to the recognition of the existence of the transgender child. This is not harmless. We could ask ourselves what kinds of interests are behind all this. It's not a huge mystery, the money can be traced. But today I'll stick to the conceptual angle. These laws are expressing that children who like boyish things or dislike girly things are boys, regardless of their sex and genitalia. And vice versa, children who like girly things or dislike boyish things are girls. And that if they change their name and submit to certain medical procedures, they can magically switch their sex. None of this is true. If we don't want laws which compel us to religiously believe in immaterial pseudoscientific foggy concepts, which entail that sexist stereotypes as to clothing and behavioral patterns are an essential part of our being and define if we are a man or a woman, which don't allow for an independent verification and rely exclusively on what someone believes about him or herself, which convey messages that are blatant lies, and which discourage critical thinking in the bargain, we absolutely must reject the introduction of the concept of gender identity into them. Social cascades can be stopped. It takes only one person to say, wait a minute, this is nonsense. Thank you very much. When I talk about men's clothes and women's clothes, I'm not implying that clothes have sex, but that's how we do go into the store and there's a men's clothes area and a women's clothes area. But of course, everything I say is compatible with dressing however you want. And there was something else. Yeah, I loved something Sheila Jeffrey said on the chat. If we just do this simple thing, substitute when anybody says gender identity, imagine they are saying sex stereotypes identity. That makes transparent how much nonsense is this, and how sexist it is to believe that we are born with sex stereotypes from factories, so to say. No, we have the innate. All feminist struggles are rendered useless, because what are we fighting against? Something we are born with and which we can't do anything against. Also, I always like to encourage my listeners to be more skeptical of what is being said to them, to question the concepts, to not go along with them. It's incredible how this thing I talked about, the assigned birth, the sex assigned at birth, why is everybody going along with it, and suddenly it seems like they think sex is assigned at birth. I'm sure if they think about it for a minute, they will discover that, oh no, it doesn't make any sense. But the thing is, why don't they think about it for a minute? No, because there's this huge fear of offending people, or of transgressing political correct language. Yeah, people are very afraid to commit literal violence with words. That doesn't happen. We shouldn't be afraid of that, because see what's happening because of it.